Former President George W. Bush's office says reports that he wouldn't vote for Trump's re-election are, quote, completely made up. But it comes as friend of the show, Hannah Trudeau, reports that Democrats desperately want Bush to endorse Joe Biden in the 2020 race.
Joining us now with his perspective on all of this and so much more is co-founding editor of The Intercept, Glenn Greenwald. Great to see you, Glenn.
Good to be with you guys.
Yep.
Your show System Update has a big program coming out today. Tell the people what they need to know.
Yeah, so the last week that I was on your show, we talked about how the shift in the discourse surrounding the coronavirus has been incredibly abrupt and radical in the wake of the George Floyd protests. And the show is an in-depth examination of whether public health officials and experts are abusing their expertise for political ends. And we interview a pulmonary specialist at Harvard Medical School who defends it. So it's a really vibrant and good debate and discussion. And it debuts today, 4:00 p.m. Eastern on the Intercept's YouTube channel.
I think it's a really important topic, so
Seriously.
people definitely go check it out. I'm going to do that. So talk to us about George W. Bush. What does it say about the Democratic Party that there's this, intense desire to seek his endorsement in this race?
So I think one of the things we're seeing playing out is old politics versus new politics. For decades in Washington, bipartisanship was kind of the golden ring. If you could get Republicans and Democrats to join together, it meant that whatever cause that brought them together was necessarily noble, even though the reality is that they agree on 95%, if not more, of their policy views. The establishment wings of both parties do. Those things tend to get off limits and ignored, so we only focus on where they disagree. So it seems like the disagreement is much greater than it is. So the idea that you could get a Republican president to endorse a Democratic candidate in kind of the politics of the 90s and the aughts was something that would be so coveted. And I think what the 2016 election proved that people still haven't internalized, at least people in Washington, is that those old rules don't really apply anymore. That, you had a Republican nominee who ran against the Bush family and the signature policies of the Bush administration and won not just the general election, but the Republican primary. Republican voters cheered him as he condemned George Bush and the Bush family. And so I think the question of whether or not that old framework is still valid is an open one.
Mm-hmm. And Glenn, I want to read you a quote. This is from Ro Khanna to the Daily Beast. He says of Bush, "I began my career in public service running against Bush's war in Iraq in 2004, but no one doubts his commitment to tolerance and inclusiveness." Now, given your own record covering the Bush administration and the Iraq war, and I'm not sure there was a lot of tolerance and inclusiveness in Abu Ghraib. Just would love your reaction to that notion that Bush was some saintly figure, even though he took the misguided view of invading Iraq.
This historical revisionism from liberals is so nauseating. And it may be my own personal experience. I began writing about politics in 2005, late 2005, for really only one reason, which was that I thought that the abuses of the Bush-Cheney administration when it came to the war on terror, when it came to extreme executive power abuses and theories of executive power, were extraordinarily menacing to basic public morality, to the constitutional order. And I remember very well the rhetoric that Democrats used to talk about George Bush and Dick Cheney. It was anything but respectful. It was anything but based on the idea that they were decent, patriotic people who were just kind of misguided when it came to policy. George Bush and Dick Cheney were talked about. George Bush was talked about like he was an evil, illiterate fanatic. And Dick Cheney was talked about like he was Satan. And Karl Rove and, Paul Wolfowitz and Don Rumsfeld, that whole crew, were depicted by Democrats and liberals relentlessly for years as an unprecedented evil, a complete aberration from everything that came before them. And so to now listen to this kind of revisionism in order to now isolate Donald Trump as this unprecedented evil is something I know to be extremely deceitful. That was never how they were talked about, nor should they be spoken of in that way. What is it that Donald Trump has done in his almost 4 years in the Oval Office that is remotely as destructive or remotely as eroding of norms, American norms, as invading a country of 26 million people based on false pretenses, or establishing a worldwide torture regime, or abducting and detaining people off the streets, not only of the Middle East, but of Europe, and shipping them to black sites hidden from the Red Cross and from international human rights monitors, or shipping them to despots to be tortured and interrogated, or things like Abu Ghraib and Guantanamo, which remains open until today. There's nothing comparable. And so to now start to talk about George Bush like he's a decent man whose endorsement Joe Biden should crave rather than repel from, I think shows not what has happened to the Republican Party, but just how decadent and ratted the Democratic Party has become.
Well, and tease that out a little bit more, because no one's going to accuse you of having Trump derangement syndrome. I think you've been very fair and consistent in your principles, whether it was a Republican or a Democrat in the White House. You tweeted the other day, though, that President Trump's actions vis-a-vis peaceful protesters in Lafayette Square and in threatening to invoke the Insurrection Act was the most menacing act, I think you said, of the past 3.5 years. Talk a little bit about that and a little bit more of his views and approach on militarism versus the George W. Bush era.
I mean, one of the reasons that I was so opposed to things like Russiagate was because I thought that the hysteria and the conspiratorial mania over trivial issues were obscuring the more substantive changes that the Trump administration was ushering in, and that when it came time to actually denounce the Trump administration validly, it would kind of be like a boy who cried wolf syndrome, because if you spend 4 years screaming that he's a traitor and that he's selling America to a foreign power based on fever dreams from Rachel Maddow, you lose the credibility to warn people that when he does something actually dangerous. Now, what Trump did in that case kind of is illustrative to me of why I don't regard him as this unique evil in American history or some grand aberration from the American political tradition. He did say that he would invoke the Insurrection Act to deploy the military on the street, but even that, as alarming and dangerous as I find that to be, is not some aberration. George Herbert Walker Bush did it during the Rodney King riots in Los Angeles. On the third day of those riots, he sent in the military in order to help the LAPD restore public order. But even there, with Trump's announcement, we don't really see these huge deployments of the military in American cities. We've seen it in bits and pieces, but we don't see the United States being militarized. He's really almost like, even if you think he has like fascist impulses, it's like almost he's like too lazy to be a fascist. He doesn't really have the follow through to implement any of this authoritarianism. You know, he cares about like appearing strong and like getting back at his enemies on Twitter. He doesn't really have the kind of dedication necessary to be that dangerous in a way that Dick Cheney and Paul Wolfowitz and David Addington and those guys definitely did have, which is what a major difference, even if you see them as coming from the same tradition.
Yeah, I think that's such an excellent point. And kind of to the bumbling nature point, I guess it's a good segue into the case of Michael Flynn, which is that, you know, you saw, Glenn, I mean, you've covered here, and we've had Matt Taibbi and others just about the abuses and the cases, and the case against Flynn, and, you know, regardless of how you feel about Flynn himself personally. Now we're seeing some developments going on with the judge. I just want to give the audience a quick update on that. What can you tell us about this judge? Seems to be declaring that the Department of Justice wanting to drop a charge against Flynn is an abuse of power by the Department of Justice itself.
Yeah, it's really bizarre. You know, for years, the idea that lying to the FBI was even a crime at all was a kind of reactionary view of the criminal justice system, and liberals were the ones leading the way in denouncing it. I think we talked about before that the jurist who wrote probably the most compelling opinion about why lying to the FBI should not be a crime is named Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And the person who went further than her, refusing to even recognize it as a crime, despite the law saying that it was John Paul Stevens. So it was always a left-wing liberal view that even lying to the FBI shouldn't even be a crime. And what's interesting is that now you have a judge who is refusing something extremely rare, which is the Justice Department saying, we were overzealous in our prosecution. We want to drop a lying to the FBI prosecution. And liberals are acting like this is some grave threat to the republic. And what Judge Walton did is he had John Gleeson, who I know very well. He's a former district judge, a former federal judge from Brooklyn, from the Eastern District of New York, in front of whom I practiced when I was a lawyer, who was known as, he was used to be a prosecutor. He's always been a very pro-prosecutorial judge, which is why they selected him. Now essentially advocating for I don't know for whom, for the judge, I guess, in saying that the prosecution against Michael Flynn should continue, even though the Justice Department has concluded that it was unjust. Imagine how threatening that is to just the basic rights of a defendant. We want prosecutors to drop prosecutions when they conclude that it's unjust. For the judge now to say, we're not going to let you, is an incredible abuse of the criminal justice system, which liberals are supposed to be working to weaken, not strengthen.
Yeah, I certainly think that's a good point.
Very important points, Glenn. Thank you so much. Great to see you as always.
Appreciate it.
Good to be with you guys. Thanks.
Next on Rising, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser. She gained national notoriety for painting Black Lives Matter on a major road, but when it comes to defunding the police, she says not so fast. Our thoughts on that next.